Welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation's latest podcast of the current series, where we seek to address the urgent energy topics of today by hearing the opinions and insights from our invited experts. The Al-Attiyah Foundation is an independent think tank aiming to provide robust and practical knowledge on global energy and sustainable development topics and communicate these for the benefit of the Foundation's members and community. So let's have a look at the context for today. Well, on today's podcast, we're looking at the role of oil and gas in a low carbon economy. Changes are occurring in the oil industry in obvious and subtle ways, changes propelled by various weighing influences we hear about every day, such as climate change and the moves to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. These trends have come from an undeniable need for energy and inescapable fact that green growth is just as essential. But also, there are many other factors in motion that are altering the rules of cheap energy. Technological change is encroaching upon oil and continues to steer energy cost reductions in many fields. Hydrogen is being prospectively spoken of as a future fuel, while methods of generating electricity are not just changing the how we generate discussion, but the how we will use it. We are moving into a time of potential major alterations in how the planet will produce and consume energy. And to help us gaze into the future of the oil industry and the green growth sprouting on the horizon, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Jorge Blazquez. Jorge is a senior economist specializing in energy transitions. Currently, he works as lead economist for power, renewable energy, and carbon markets at BP. Previously, his professional career developed in both the private and public sectors. He worked as senior researcher at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Saudi Arabia. Also, Jorge, together with other researchers, wrote a seminal paper, the Renewable Energy Policy Paradox, in 2016. So, good afternoon, Jorge, and welcome to an Al-Attiyah Foundation activity.
So thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with the foundation, ready to talk about the energy transition.
Lovely. Thanks, Jorge. Well, you are, as I said, an economist dealing with power, renewable energy, and the carbon markets. So I guess we all understand power and renewable energy, but can you explain a little more about the work you do on carbon markets?
Well, this is an easy question. Probably the easiest one of this interview. It's quite simple. When there is a change in carbon policy or carbon regulation, I analyze what is the impact on carbon prices and carbon markets, and also the impact in energy markets. In particular, I concentrate on the impact on energy demand, oil, gas, coal, and also how the change in carbon prices impact on the different fuels competitiveness, because when you have the carbon price, you also change the relative cost of different fuels. So an easy question, it's basically to understand the impact of carbon and regulation, carbon policy and carbon regulations on energy demand and supply. That's it.
Brilliant. Okay, that's a really good outline for this podcast, I think, Jorge, and very interesting too. Right, moving on to our main reason for talking to you today, which is the BP Outlook 2050. Can you please describe to us what that outlook is and its present conclusions and projections?
Okay. The energy outlook this year is organized around three key scenarios and covers between 2018 and 2050. The first scenario is called the business as usual. In these scenarios, we assume that policies, technologies, and social preference evolve in a manner which is consistent with the recent past. In this scenario, there is an increase in emissions. They peak around 2025 and then decline. But more or less, the level of emission in 2050 is only 10% below our current level of emissions. So very little decarbonization, no significant progress reducing carbon emissions. The second scenario is called rapid, which is consistent with Paris Agreement. This means that the level of emissions decline by 70% in year 2050. And the reason for this is a substantial increase in carbon prices due to a tightening of carbon policies. So significant decarbonization in this one. The last one is called net zero, And it's a scenario which is even more ambitious than this rapid. In this scenario, in addition to the increase in carbon prices, there is a change in social preferences, there is a change in consuming behavior, and the combination of these two factors has led to a decline in carbon emissions to around 95%. So almost an economy which is fully decarbonized globally. So three very different scenarios, but surprisingly, there are some common trends, and I'm going to mention three. The first one is that there is a decline in absolute levels in the consumption of hydrocarbons. I'm not talking about here about the share of hydrocarbons on the energy mix, which today is around 85, and depending on the scenario can be 25, between 20 and 65. I'm talking of on the absolute level. And here we have a decline, which is something which is truly unprecedented. Never in the history of modern energy has been a systematic decline in the consumption of any traded fuel. Never. This is the first time it is going to happen. The second key characteristic or common trend is the massive increase in renewable energy in three scenarios, even in the business as usual, where I said at the beginning, there is little decarbonization. In this scenario, renewable energy is going to penetrate the energy system faster than any other fuel in history. It is the fastest increase in any energy that the world has seen before. So another true remarkable fact. And the last one has to do with electrification. In the three scenarios, there are a significant amount in the electricity demand, and this is why we can deploy so much renewable energy, wind and solar in particular. And this is more or less the summary of the energy outlook. Three scenarios, three big tendencies, some of them.
And that third scenario you outlined initially, Jorge, the net zero scenario, is the one that's received, I think, the most attention. But with COVID-19 being the black swan event that was unforeseen, I think many people may not realize the depth of change now in motion, and certainly accelerated by COVID. And that lack of realization brings me a similar concern. That is, we've got used to the idea that we may have passed peak oil, but peak gas is something new to us. Many commentators forecast that gas must remain as part of the energy mix post-2050. So can you elaborate on the concepts of peak oil and peak gas and what they mean right now for society and into the next 30 years?
Okay. Here I'm going to be honest. I cannot answer about the peak oil. I don't know if the peak oil is still above, in front of us. Is it something that is going to happen in the future, or already happened in 2019? I mean, some people is arguing that the peak oil happened already last year, and because of COVID and the decline the decline in economic activity, and also the deterioration of economic perspectives have an impact on oil demand and will never recover. We don't know that. I cannot predict the future. I mean, even more, as we used to say, we cannot predict the future. We have three scenarios. In business as usual, there is still oil growing until 2025 and then decline. In the other two scenarios, in rapid and net zero, oil demand, the peak oil, took place in 2019. So the question is, the answer to this question is I really don't know. But I think the important point here is not when the peak oil is going to happen or if it's already happened. Oil is going to be a critical fuel of the energy mix in the next 15 years at least. And if in the energy outlook of this year, we have a section on investment. And in this section, we explore what is the amount of investment needed for upstream oil and gas in the three scenarios. And the amount that we have is between 10 and 20 trillions of dollars. So about the peak oil itself, I mean, the moment in which oil start to decline, I think is not important. The important message is that oil is going to be a key fuel of the energy mix, and still trillions of dollars of investment are needed to supply the energy, the demand of oil that is going to happen in the next 30 years. The outlook for gas is totally different. I mean, gas is a very resilient fuel in the three scenarios. Even in rapid, which is consistent with Paris Agreement, gas continues to grow until 2000 for the next 15 years and then decline. But the level of consumption in 2050 is more or less the level of consumption today. So gas is very resilient. And why is so different oil from gas? And there are two reasons for this. The first is that gas has a role in supporting the shift away from coal to renewables, in particular in the power sector. And this is especially true in developing Asia, where the role of coal in the power sector is critical. And the second reason is that natural gas can be combined very easily with carbon capture and storage to generate almost decarbonized energy. So these two reasons explain why gas, or the outlook for gas, is much more resilient than the outlook for oil.
Can I just take you back, Jorge, to oil again, and specifically refining, which is having a difficult time because of COVID, and the notions of peak oil. And you talked about, you looked into your crystal ball for the future, but I wonder, are the changes likely to be long lasting?
So the outlook that we have for refining and refining activity is not positive. I mean, there is a weak demand for oil that I already mentioned. In this rapid transition, there is a decline in refining activity by almost 50%. It is even higher in the case of net zero. But there is another factor which is putting pressure on refining activity, which is excess of capacity. Currently, there are plans to increase refining capacity by 9 million barrels per day in the next 5 years or so. And this number does not include potential expansions in India and some key countries, in particular in Africa. So the combination of these two elements, weak demand for oil, excess of capacity, is putting a lot of pressure on the refining industry. Even in business as usual, we will have a more positive outlook for oil. This excess in capacity refining leads to an increase in competition and eventually some shutdowns of less competitive refineries. So no, not positive outlook for the refining industry in this outlook.
Okay, well, let's focus now on your role as lead economist at BP, because BP is looking to refocus its strategy and has already made some changes for what is essentially a fossil fuel company to become a net zero emitting company by 2050 is a big call. How will BP do it? And clearly, based on recent announcements, offshore wind will play a major part in that strategy. But what other changes or strides will be taken by BP for it to become, in quotes, a total energy company?
So this is far from my field of expertise. So I'm going to give you an overall picture of the strategy. I want to think about this as BP also transitioning, as the energy system is transitioning. BP is transitioning from an international oil company to an integrated energy company. And this transition is based on 3 pillars. The first one is low carbon electricity, low carbon energy. And here the role of renewables is going to be critical. As you said, it's going to be solar, it's going to be wind onshore, wind offshore. In fact, there's a target to achieve 50 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. But in addition to this, BP is seeking to have advanced positions in hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And also to complement this pillar, it's building or creating portfolio of gas consumers, gas customers. The second pillar it's convenience and mobility is the name that it has. And the idea here is to take advantage and to accelerate on the transportation revolution that is already taking place, while putting at the same time the consumer at the heart of the strategy. For example, BP here has a clear strategy to increase substantially the number of charging stations for electric vehicles. We have already 7,500. There are plans to increase this to 70,000 by 2030. And the last pillar of this strategy, it's called resilient hydrocarbons. And the idea is to reduce the production of oil, to reduce the refining activity, but go as a consequence of this strategy, become more competitive on this sector. At the same time, security has to be at the center of this strategy. So this is more or less the type of pillars that BP has to transition from one type of company to another, which is low electricity, low carbon electricity, low carbon energy, mobility, and convenience and mobility, and resilient hydrocarbons. So 3 pillars for a complete transformation of the company.
Well, moving away, Jorge, for the moment from BP and to society's slow divergence from the direct use of fossil fuels, it seems that for both national and international oil companies, there is that danger of so-called stranded assets. They remain physically available, but they aren't economically viable. Is that a real danger?
I mean, it is. I mean, it's something which we have to have in mind. But I'm going to take advantage of your question to introduce another of our scenarios. It's called the delayed and disorderly transition. And this scenario is precisely designed to point out some of the risk of a delayed transition. And in particular, one of the risks is this of the stranded assets. And let me explain how this scenario works. I mean, in this scenario, nothing really happened in the next 10 years. So the path of the energy system is identical to the business as usual. There is no action to reduce really the level of carbon emissions. In year 2030, there is a change in the preference of society, and the society pushed the government to implement policies and to achieve Paris targets, and to achieve the targets that were set in the Paris Agreement in year 2016. The government then put policies in place, and the energy mix shift from hydrocarbons to renewables as fast as they can. Energy efficiency improve as fast as it can, but the combination of these two factors, which are the one driving the change in the energy mix in rapid, are not enough to reduce emissions quickly enough. There is no enough time. So the only card that the government has in his hands, it's energy rationing, which are policies which stop or restrict energy using output or activities. So it's simply you cannot do certain activities that will require energy. In this scenario, there are heavy economic losses. And it's here where the problem of stranded assets is really evident. So yes, we can be worried about some stranded assets in a rapid transition or net zero, but really where the problem of stranded assets is really relevant and important if there is a delay and disorderly transition like this one that I'm explaining. So if suddenly society wants to achieve the climate targets, and suddenly government has to implement very tough policies to restrict energy consumption. So this is how we see the things in this scenario. This is the scenario which is relevant for stranded assets, I think.
And especially as COVID is accelerating all kinds of events on all kinds of fronts too. Well, carbon capture and storage is the technology that could mitigate the shift from oil and gas towards low carbon sources. Currently, there are some facilities working and they're capturing around 40 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. What are the perspectives for this technology, Jorge? To what extent does carbon capture and storage represent an opportunity for the oil and gas industry in a decarbonized economy?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, carbon and storage has a role to play in a decarbonized economy, and in particular, it provides it provides three types of services, if you want. First, it provides almost decarbonized energy to the power sector and industrial activities. I mean, some activities cannot be decarbonized. Sometimes you need to balance the power sector and you need firm power. Carbon capture and storage combined with gas is an opportunity to do this. The second type of activity which carbon capture is going to do is to, in combination with natural gas, produce blue hydrogen. This is hydrogen produced using gas reforming. The emissions of this industrial process are captured and storage. And the last type of service that our activity, if you prefer, that carbon capture has to play in a decarbonized economy is providing negative emission. When you combine carbon capture and storage with biomass or with bioenergy, you generate negative emissions. And why is this important? Because there are some activities which are very difficult to decarbonize. For example, shipping, for example, long distance flights. The emission of these sectors needs to be offsets. And carbon capture and storage with bioenergy represent an opportunity to do this. So effectively, yes, carbon capture and storage is an opportunity for the hydrocarbon sector, and in particular in the rapid transition, in this one which is consistent with Paris Agreement, the level of natural gas combined with carbon capture represents around 8% of total primary energy. So a significant amount of energy is provided using this technology. So we think it has to play a role in a decarbonized economy, carbon capture.
So for the future, we can, I think most of us already see more solar, wind, and perhaps gas energy. But what about other fuels? And we are hearing a lot about hydrogen. You mentioned blue hydrogen. But is there real progress for hydrogen as a fuel? And in which industrial sectors? And you mentioned aviation, Airbus talking about hydrogen in aviation recently. Is it a good transport solution? Is ammonia a good transport solution for hydrogen? Or is the possibility of small nuclear plants or reactors a more viable alternative to solar and wind?
Well, in general terms, the easiest way to decarbonize an activity is through electricity. This is the textbook solution, if you want. But some activities cannot be electrified. I mean, I have mentioned long distance transportation, shipping, but also, for example, some industrial activities that require very high temperature cannot be electrified. And we need to find a solution for these activities. In principle, there are two different solutions. One is bioenergy, and the other is hydrogen. And we think hydrogen will play a role in the energy transition and will play a role in a decarbonized energy sector. Right now, in the rapid transition, which is a scenario consistent with Paris, hydrogen represents around 6% of total final consumption. In net zero, this number is much higher, it's around 50-20%. So there is a substantial energy demand which is going to be satisfied with hydrogen. Transportation, industry, different activities. Now, if you ask me And what type of energy, what type of hydrogen are we going to be using? Is going to be green hydrogen? This is hydrogen produced using renewable energy, or is going to be blue hydrogen, hydrogen produced using natural gas in combination with carbon capture and storage? Well, the BP scenarios have both type of hydrogen broadly in the same amount. It's around 50% green hydrogen, 50% blue hydrogen. So there is the role for both types of hydrogen, and both types of hydrogen has to play a role helping to decarbonize those sectors which carbon emissions are hard to abate. So we think hydrogen is going to be an energy significant in the energy mix of the future, yes.
Fantastic, Jorge. Very interesting, those insights. Sadly, I think we have to leave our interview now, but thank you again for your insights and your time today. And we look forward to hearing you again on the Al-Attiyah podcasts.
Has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you also for your time and your questions.
No
thank you to the foundation.
Okay, well, thanks, Jorge. Watch your space for the next Al-Attiyah podcast in the series. I'm Stephen Cole. Goodbye.